What you are about to watch is a sincere conversation around the COVID-19 or coronavirus lockdown that's taken place over the Western world over the last few weeks. Now, most of the conversations that you find online around the coronavirus focus on the health effects of the virus itself, but we've decided to take a different approach today and instead focus on the negative health effects of specifically the lockdown. Because if you think about the world in this biopsychosocial model, which we like to talk about on this channel an awful lot, based in the work of the great depth psychologist Carl Jung, at least primarily, then you have the biological layer, the psychological layer, and the social layer to the way human beings function. And what we've done with the lockdown is, using our political systems, we've created a massive perturbation on the social layer of said model. And so we can expect to see ramifications as a result of this. Human beings are not the nice fluffy things that we like to make them out to be. No matter what we see on the news, or the propaganda, perhaps, around how everybody is banding together and helping each other out, underneath lies the ancestral psyche. And beneath the ancestral psyche lies instinct. And of course, if you take a population and you tell them to go sit in the proverbial cave, then instincts will start to kick back in one form or another. And that's what we talk about in this conversation. In particular, we focus on the effects on breathing and respiration that can take place, so purely on the biological layer. But indeed, we then stray into the more masculine instinct side of things, the more predatory nature of things that might pop up. And indeed, we talk about masculinity and the political system of the modern world as a whole towards the second half of the podcast. Now, I have to make a quick disclaimer here. Within the podcast, we talk about a new manual that we have just released called the Charing Cross Method. And this podcast was originally planned to be released after the one which you'll see after this one, if you see what I mean. So that particular exposition might seem a little bit out of place, but we do have many podcasts planned over the next couple of weeks on the subject of breathing, of hyperventilation, on burnout, and indeed specifically on how complexes can breathe you and how this ties into the biopsychosocial model. So if you'd like a copy, prematurely without us telling you much about it, of said manual, then you can pick it up in the description down below. But never fear, we will perform a full exegesis on this over the coming few podcasts. But without any further ado, we bring you the Jung To Live By COVID-19 special.
Well, on the subject of breathing generally, obviously in an environment like we have now, in the times that we have now with COVID, people are going to be very, very careful about how they breathe. But that's not happening in isolation to the already ingrained maladaptive patterns of respiration that people may have. We're just adding an extra loading to that, the fear of breathing in a virus and then having a social distance. People will be holding their breath more or taking more shallow breaths. So they'll be inadvertently hyperventilating, bearing in mind that hyperventilation is not something which is obvious necessarily. It's just breathing in excess of your body's physiological needs. So it's possible to hyperventilate at rest and unobtrusively, purely because of stress and of habit. You add an already stressed individual with bad breathing habits and someone who is perhaps fatigued or exhausted because of the stress that they're under, you add that to a COVID lockdown situation, it's going to get very strange. Very, very strange, very soon.
It's going to be on two levels, right? So people consciously trying to change their breathing habits in a way. And not necessarily, they could be holding their breath, I guess, if they go outside. Though I see people walking around with like masks on and things to try and protect themselves. So there could be that, but there's also the panic aspect as well. And I've seen people on social media, like normal people who would keep their heads straight at all times. And all of a sudden, it's like, we're all going to die. We're all screwed. Or it's the conspiracy theory territory of it's all orchestrated by the government. Regardless of what the real cause is, it's just like it puts stress on an individual. I can see how this could be extraordinarily dangerous to somebody, actually.
Yeah. Think about somebody sitting in front of their computer, accessing the internet, who is already stressed. And they're accessing information on the internet that feeds in literally to their concerns. And they may have a bad posture and bad breathing at rest because they're on a computer screen or a keyboard or whatever. So that's all in place and it's ready to summate to an even worse situation. Then once you add to that the necessity to leave their home to obtain food and supplies, And then we've had recently the kind of pictures that we've had even today of mass burials in New York. This is definitely going to feed in to people's concerns. But fears always constellate around instincts. And when you think that in normal everyday life, fear or negative emotions of a particularly strong intensity tend to create complexes, it's far worse when you get down to the level of instinct, because the amount of power, if you like, or libido, which is invested in an instinct, compared that to a complex, there's just no comparison at all. The genomic self, the genome, if you like, the gene expression will release far more investiture of energy and physiological and psychological resources into an instinct, particularly one that threatens survival, if that instinct is compromised, than it will for pretty much any complex. So we're setting up a situation where complexes will trigger not archetypes, but instincts at the deepest of levels. So it's not good.
Which of these instincts do you think is most... what has you most concerned? What keeps you awake at night? Stuff like this. In what area?
If you think that being forced into lockdown, in effect, is a throwback to living in a cave. Caves and cave people, paleo-humans were building. They were building buildings. They were building shelters before and after they were occupied in caves. So selecting a cave to live in, a restricted, protected, lockdown space, means there's some advantage for survival from a paleo-human, and therefore the paleo-human brain that we still carry within us and all of its associated instincts. If you venture out of the cave into a hostile environment, it'll be for foraging, for resources. It'll be for competition, therefore, for resources. There'll be elements of hunting and gathering. Fundamental male instincts will be motivated towards hunting and towards territoriality, protecting both the cave and the extended territory that he, the family group, and the tribe all consider to be theirs in order to maximize resources. Paleo-human females in those times were primarily orientated towards gathering and towards raising of children within the protected space, that is to say, the home. We're being forced into a lockdown situation now where we're cut off from our extended peer and support networks, or seeing them, when we meet them on the street, as being potentially dangerous with respect to transmitting a fatal disease or a potentially fatal disease. All of this will mobilize those primitive instincts for hunting and gathering, and therefore competition. Another effect will be the way that the state overall, psychologically, is reacting to this situation. It's probably doing it with the best of intentions. The problem, though, is that it will enforce the lockdown, primarily through suggestion, through the media, but they're also ramping up the notion that the state, in the form of the police, will intervene and start to take away your liberty. They may even intervene to the extent of checking your basket when, say, if it were a woman, for example, in the sense of looking at this from an instinctive perspective, from a paleo-human sense, checking a woman's basket to see whether she's actually gone out to shop for essentials. That will really, really impact, in this case, that woman's primary instincts to be able to gather for her family and for herself. The police, in that sense, will start to appear like they are predators. They're part of the threat in the environment. There aren't at the moment saber-toothed tigers out there, or other predators. There aren't cave bears, cave lions, and so forth. The immediate focus then of the projection of an instinctive threat will, if we go on and we're not careful, will become the police and therefore the state. It's very, very dangerous, and it has to be handled properly. With men going out with their instincts for territoriality and protection and hunting, they will start to see the police not necessarily as predators, but perhaps as rivals for control of territory and resources. And that will blow up eventually if it isn't handled properly, because the male instincts will just start to power through, and complexes then will be readjusted, according to instinctive pressure. I'm not talking about archetypal fantasies now, or the hero cycle, or any culturally generated myth. We're talking about fundamentals and how powerfully that they can be motivated. To go back to respiration, one of the problems there, of course, is that in the build-up to people having their instincts triggered for survival, is the complexes will be activated because it's more superficial. So anxiety is generated. And when respiration is disturbed, then physiology is disturbed, psychology is disturbed, and you start to get very, very weird symptoms in your body, which might, with a little bit more overloading, actually transduce into a real physical illness, all of which is going to stress the health service and stress the individual in that state and the individual's immediate family in the cave. And when the NHS doesn't have the resources to come out and see someone who might have, for example, a hyperventilation-induced heart attack, or coronary artery spasm, or arrhythmia, or an epileptiform seizure, all due to stress, then the NHS, which at the moment is being used as a lightning rod to download or upload positive collective feelings, will start to become identified with the state and with a failing of the state, and therefore a threat. So if things go on like this, it could get bad. I really hope it doesn't, but we need to look at it. And there's a very definite physiology involved, just to return back to the breathing. Isn't there, Paul, with respect to what happens?
There is indeed. I was just thinking as you were talking, Steve, that it might be useful to extend the concept of breathing as well, because even things like sighing and yawning and coughing, and given that COVID involves a cough, are all modified forms of breathing. So if you bear that in mind, you've got another overlay onto probably what's already a very difficult situation. So I think just to broaden that idea out as well is probably useful. And obviously, as Steve is suggesting, there's all the underlying changes in the body's chemistry that are created as a result of those disturbances. So it can be useful to know something about that.
Yeah, I'd like to, for a moment, return to the concept of instincts, because it's reminded me actually more politically. And I traditionally, in my youth, I was still a youth, I've much preferred the more libertarian American way of doing politics. It's the don't tread on me, leave me alone type of thing. Not because it's not because intellectually I'm like, well, public services are bad because of taxes X, Y, Z, but it's purely, it feels like an instinctual thing of leave me the hell alone. It's like I want to provide for myself, provide for my family, etc., etc., etc. So it's like I remember when this thing first broke out, I was talking to one of my business partners about this, and I remember saying the founding fathers of the USA would be absolutely appalled at the way that we've responded to it in this country in particular, because it's basically go into your house and sort of sit there. You can't leave, we in control. So I was wondering if this instincts thing could actually be applied more generally politically to people who are more prone to, say, either libertarian or financially more right-wing positions, if you see what I mean. Would that be based in instinct rather than, say, because I've seen psychological models, I've seen the Big Five be used, for example, as a way of attempting to describe why different people go towards different political systems. But you reckon fundamentally it does come down to instinct?
Well, yeah, I think it must do, because instinctive human behavior has essentially led towards culture and all of its manifestations. So anything like that will be based on those primary instincts for survival, reproduction, territoriality, resources, kinship bonds, which reinforces all of that. And of course, kinship bonds eventually become political bonds as well. Whether it's left or right, I don't think that matters. Certainly from my perspective, it doesn't. I don't have a view politically on that. I'm just interested in what causes it all. And what happens if too much pressure is put on a society as a whole. Always it boils down to instincts. It does in wartime, it does in times of massive social unrest. And I am worried. I was actually contacted by 3 journalists, British UK national journalists, over the past few days to comment on that, and on the subjective instinct, because it's the thing that's always there and that we always forget. Because we're always too concerned, as Jung said, with the contents of our immediate conscious mind, and we imagine whatever's preoccupying us there is all that there is. It's not the case. It really isn't. But I'm seeing it now. I am, a former police officer, as I think many people on the Discord know. I'm very, very well aware of how police officers patrol their beats. When you think about it, it's a territorial thing immediately. You also give people power over an area, which means they have the power to take away a person's liberty who operates on your patch, on your beat. And they tend to patrol it rather like sharks. This is fine. This is absolutely fine when it's policing by consent. And when the police officers, the metaphorical sharks who are patrolling their beat, understand fully what that means and that they're there to serve the people. When the people appear to the police to be a problem en masse, that's not good. Because you then get a very clear demarcation and separation of instincts. So if the police are put under pressure, they will start to see the public as being the problem. And what can evolve from that is that the police will in effect become a socio-cultural autoimmune problem. That which should protect the public will turn on it in the same way that the immune system in an autoimmune disease will turn on the host body. That's not good. That's not good for anyone. So this has to be handled properly. And I really hope that the government have been properly advised on this. I doubt that they are, because they will see the police as just functionaries. Of course they are. That's the problem. Because where there's a low level of collective consciousness in a group or an organization, they will default automatically to instinct. And if what they're doing in terms of their function is very, very primary anyway, when you take away the niceties of culture and the controls that we have in an ordered society, then you can expect that to ramp up. And I do think we're seeing signs of that now. The concern, as I say, I have is that people will start to get very, very frustrated with staying in the cave. We've already seen fights breaking out over food.
And within the cave as well, because there's an increase in domestic abuse as well, isn't there, currently?
That's happening.
Yeah.
And again, you can call or consider that to be a modification of instinct, because the instincts lead to the disturbance at the two-person family system level. And then you get violence and abuse and so forth, people who don't normally spend that much time together and who aren't in equilibrium over that kind of state. And of course, through that, you get the anxiety, you get the overbreathing, you get all the consequential effects of that, which lead to changes in the body. And it's a massive cascading effect within an enclosed vessel, which is the cave or the home. And eventually that will have to blow. It'll implode and then blow out, probably, in the same way that you get with a supernova, a star. When that goes off, it implodes first and then blows out. And the effects of that outer explosion are catastrophic. So I guess for as long as people are too afraid of the potential effects of this awful disease, which is real and is killing people, then there will be a restraint. But I do worry about the regulating system, the social regulating system we've got, which is the police, and the psychology of the police. When they begin to consider the public should be corralled, rather like sheep, and perhaps the sheepdogs will turn into wolves. Let's hope not, but I'm beginning to see signs of that, which are of significant concern.
We've also got the financial concern as well. I don't think we brought it up yet, where people are being, lots of people anyway, are being put on, I think it's 80% pay for X amount of time. But lots of people live paycheck to paycheck. So if you put somebody on 80% pay, most people are going to, not most, but lots of people are going to be completely screwed by it. If they're renters, for example. If I was in my PhD still, I would be completely screwed. It's like, well, where the hell am I going to live? So it concerns me, actually. This was strange. Why people went so easily into the cave in the first place? Because it was an immediate thing. It was like the head bear or whatever, the head primate. He stands up and goes, everyone go into the cave, and if you leave, basically we're going to fine you, and we're going to break up all parties. And people went so easily into the cave in the first place. And I'm wondering if there's a reason for that. Because my initial instinctual response was basically like, no, I had to, but it was a no. And I was wondering if that is most people's initial response is like, no, you can't lock me in the cave. I don't care what you say. Even if there's a reason for it, like there's a real danger, the instincts aren't going to be argued with, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. They don't want to be argued with, but there is a summating effect of several instincts kicking in. And then there's a rational choice, albeit a rational choice at an instinctive level, because at that level, one instinct will play off against one or more others. And then you get a resultant effect, which is adaptive for survival. At the moment, that's working. In repressive cultures, and there are plenty of them, and nation states around the world, you see various levels of this going on anyway. And provided that control remains in place, the real threat of a police state, like at the level of North Korea, for example, and of some of the regiments from the past, like Nazi Germany, where that is absolutely a real fact that the force can be delivered and you can be taken out, then you're less likely to rise up and cause a problem. But now we have a very run-down police force. It couldn't cope before. It's not going to be able to cope now if things really do boil over. And this is where the issue of policing by consent, at least in the UK, has always managed to keep the lid on things, because generally most people consented to being policed. But if you push them into a situation where they don't consent any longer, and the nation state is unable to enforce the lack of consent from the people, then you're going to get a significant breakdown in social order based on instinct. And you, for example, described then competing instincts. The instinct to assert yourself, which is basically orientated towards your own survival, your own resources, your own status and self-assertion, your own peer group, all of those things all starts to add up. But you're also aware of the fact that survival instinct number one, might just take you out with COVID. It might take any of us out. So we kind of err on balance there and say, okay, for now. But there will come a point when for now is past. I just hope we don't get to that point, because the police service we have is incapable of enforcing a lockdown if the consent for it disappears. That would be tragic for a number of reasons, because you get the social breakdown, but it doesn't solve the problem of the virus either and of the pandemic. And then people will just default to individual expression of instincts, or the expression of instincts within families and kin groups, and it will get horrendous.
Especially because this is off the heels of, say, the political paranoia, I say, of the last few years. We had the whole Brexit thing and the whole Trump thing. So people are all like stirred up in a pot already. And then it's more prominent in the US. But there is a case of people don't trust the government. You know, stronger over there, but there is a case of it here at the same time. And it's creeping into social media. It's all over the place. And so I thought that people wouldn't trust the political system immediately after 2016. I thought that. And then the whole Brexit thing goes on and people still don't trust it. And now we've been told to sit in the cave and everything else, when if you go look at the stats, you're not going to die for someone like myself. So it's like, it's building.
But I guess an even worse case scenario, James, would be to lose your cave in the way that you described before, that if you were to be ruined financially, and that is a threat, a real threat for a lot of people, that is almost a worse case scenario than being told to get in the cave and behave yourself.
You mean in terms of actually getting into trouble and being arrested?
No, I mean simply like you put it yourself so simply, that you couldn't afford to pay your rent, so you no longer have a roof over your head.
Yeah,
that's an even worse prospect, really, than having a place to go back to.
Yeah, it's another instinct, isn't it?
It's another instinct,
which is kicking in and being manipulated.
Yeah.
You know, this is my point over archetypes. The archetypes just don't matter in a situation like this, because archetypes essentially are fantasies, or what we interpret as being archetypes are collective fantasies. When they mean anything at all, they will reflect underlying instincts. But I think the major problem for people is to understand that human instincts, although they are similar and we have them in common to some extent with animals, are also themselves more evolved. The unconscious evolves too. It's not static. For example, at another level of analysis, description and explanation, it will do so because we've evolved consciousness. Therefore, the unconscious will evolve in reaction to that. And the expression of human instincts is altered too. To me, there is absolutely no need to attach a hypothetical additional layer to instincts and call them archetypes. You know, what we think of as archetypes biologically are just instincts, and then there's the socio-cultural representation of them. The culture is changing at the moment. COVID is changing people. So this will have an effect at the way the culture expresses itself. Depending on its ultimate effect and how long it lasts, it will disappear. How many people have been worried recently about Spanish flu from 1918 to 1921? Probably nobody, because most of the people who went through that have died. They're gone. You know? But at the time, people reacted to that in a similar way that we're reacting now, although the government response was nowhere near on the level that it is. So what we're going through now might be represented epigenetically or in future generations, or it might not, but it will certainly affect culture for a while. So there's lots that are going on. But back to the issue of respiration. You know, in all cultures, breathing has been considered symbolically and religiously to be of immense importance, because we know, and we will know at a deep structure level, at a physiological, metabolic level, that it isn't just that breath and soul are the same thing. Proper breathing regulates everything, and it's not just oxygen either. It's the level of carbon dioxide. The CO2 level in your blood and in the body's tissues basically regulates the acid-base balance of your body. Oxygen contributes nothing to the pH of your body. pH is such a fine balance. If you go outside of those tolerances, either way, you will die very quickly, very, very quickly.
Well, if you have too much carbon dioxide, you're in danger of suffocating.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's an inbuilt thing as well, physiologically, that, you know, if the levels build up too high, then you'll get a kind of a, you know, your body will have an alarm reaction to that. But then having said that too, the chemoreceptors in the body that register that are set at different levels for different people as well. So again, what's normal in a given population is very variable.
Yes,
and obviously we've, you know, found that to be the case with the use of the capnograph and so on.
We absolutely have.
Yeah.
There are standard ranges which are considered to be normal or borderline, and you will see people who are adapted to very abnormally low levels of carbon dioxide, and they seem to be functioning,
and that's normal for them,
just fine.
Yeah.
But what you do see is that the reserve is very, very fine. And if you overload them at that point, even though they appear to be in an abnormal state already and they're not expressing any physical or psychological symptoms, you push them just a little bit and then they're gone. There is, I think I've mentioned this chap before, there was one fellow on another podcast who'd been a fit man all of his life, and he was a tennis player. And he was a relative of someone that we were seeing. In fact, it was a family therapy situation. We'd done a family enactment with them, and it had been filmed on their request. Very, very complex psychodynamics going on, quite literally. And he was sighing significantly, not just during that, which you might expect from the overloading of stress, but also as reported by his son in terms of him playing tennis. His blood pressure was normal. There was nothing wrong with his serum cholesterol or anything like that. And his heart rate and rhythm, when he'd been checked out, was all normal. Yeah. But he came in and went on the capnograph, and the alarm was on constantly at rest. And the rest of his case history, you know, really, really raised an alarm in me. I thought, any more loading on this guy, and he's going to go. And then he said he was going to take a long-haul flight to Hong Kong on business. And I felt my stomach churn at that. And I couldn't stop saying it. I said, if you do that, you're going to die. I really feel that, because right at this moment, you know, this will take you out, because, you know, and he said, oh no, my blood pressure is fine. My beats per minute is 60. I have no problem. I'm fit. Oh, okay, fine. Yeah. I supported him in that, didn't reject him, reassured him, but I nevertheless felt that intuition. He got on the plane, and just before he got to Hong Kong, he died. Now, you might say that's because I told him he was going to, which was not the case. Any additional loading, and that would include the environmental loading on his cardiovascular system of being on a long-haul flight, would have been sufficient to do it. Had he not gone on that flight, and had he undertaken a proper retraining of his breathing, the kind of thing that we'd routinely done. And remember, Paul and I trained in a cardiac rehab unit, Charing Cross Hospital in London. We were very experienced. We knew what we were looking at and what we were seeing. Had he not gone on that flight, he probably would have lived a lot longer.
Yeah.
I kind of want to ask you something more positive, actually, because we were talking about this recently, about this idea of the hermetically sealed container. And we were saying about within the cave, it could also be this sealed container. And within it, there can be alchemy. So we've talked about instincts, and talked about respiration, but there's also the alchemical side of the human soul and psychobiology and all this stuff. Could this lockdown be used by people? They're sort of sitting there, they've not got as much to do, kind of bored. Could this be used productively in any capacity, in, say, a Jungian alchemical sense?
Well, both in an alchemical sense, psychologically, but also in a physiological sense too, because, people who, and I've said this many times, normally have very busy lives, are out there doing things, can use it as a time for conservation withdrawal, a time to actually marshal their energy and their physical energy, as well as dealing with their psychological health. Yeah,
I like this. So a time to recharge, a time to look after themselves, time for rest, a time for sleep, time for restoration, all that kind of stuff.
Which may be, foreign to some people because of the kind of lives that they lead. But it is possible to make some of those changes.
Just very, very quickly, of course, these are the changes that we've described in the Charing Cross method, which you've described in previous videos, but you can pick up a copy of that, the link in the description down below. Basically, it shows you how you can avoid burnout, avoid exhaustion. And indeed, if you are in that state, which potentially you're in one of these hyperventilation states, how you can get yourself out of it. And of course, no suggestion, but to avoid a case like your patient there, the guy on the flight to Hong Kong, because it goes to show how these things hide themselves. And indeed, I've suffered with that as well, and it's not. I didn't die on a flight, thankfully, but there was a case recently where I was going to take a flight, and Steve, you told me that story, and I was like, maybe I shouldn't take the flight, and so I am still alive. So I'll put it down to your omniscient wisdom.
Yeah, it's a dramatic one. Unfortunately, it was true. It's tragic, but there are lots of other ways that you can put yourself in that state. The number of young and fit and healthy joggers who die with no cardiac disease, it's not apparently clear, but it could have been an arrhythmia, for example. That could have easily have been caused by an acid-base disorder because they've over-exercised, leading to an arrhythmia, or a coronary artery spasm, because once the coronary arteries narrow, you get a heart attack, whether those arteries are diseased or not, and they open again, and there's no sign of heart disease. But sadly, they opened up after you died.
Yeah,
it can be like that.
It can.
Yeah,
I'm just thinking, Steve, too, of the way people react to that.
Yeah.
And particularly now, they'll probably react to that kind of news very badly, because it's like, well, how do you make sense of that rationally, that this fit and healthy person has just hit the deck and there's no apparent medical reason for it, and then you use that to harm yourself and to generate anxiety and panic in yourself and maybe other people. Whereas, like Steve says, once you actually think more broadly and you understand more broadly the kind of things that can happen, suddenly you have an explanation for things.
I was talking about this on the Discord this morning. There was a slightly different example, but it's the idea of how the hell you actually define health in the first place. Because obviously you take a look at someone who's fit and healthy and you're like, they're fit and healthy. And it's like, how the hell do you know? It's like, well, because they're preferably thin and they have a lot of energy. And it's like, okay, that means that they're fit and healthy? No. And it's like, this is why you got to go bio, psycho, social. So yeah, if there's like a hidden thing which people don't normally see, then we need to probably expand our definition of what health is. And indeed, to do that, you've got to emphasize lifestyle points, actually, because if it is a hidden thing, and if it does require some level of education, then it's like, maybe there should be ways in which people live their lives. And in general, that should be stay the hell away from stress, which is why I want to keep emphasizing that in these podcasts, because I know what it's like to be in that state where you're trying to overachieve. And it is so seductive, but it is so not worth it, because you are not a superhero.
Well, there's, if I could make the distinction, there's stress, isn't there? And there's something called eustress, EU stress as well, which is considered to be a more positive type of stress. And you know, if it's the first kind of stress, say for example you're living with people who stress you negatively, and you're in what we would call a high adrenaline household or high arousal household, clearly that's not good for health. But there are some forms of stress which do nonetheless drive you to achieve more productive and more positive things. So again, it's probably important the kind of language that we use here, you know, in order to get a proper compass on things.
Agreed. There's, of course, the probably err on the side of caution, though, in general, should be taken as the case. Because if we take as a general rule, people are on average more exhausted and more stressed than they are, then the chances of them being pushed over that edge just exponentially higher. Especially if people don't know, for example, the states of hyperventilation. And if it comes down to, I've done it before, this was pointed out to me long before I met you two, actually, by one of the friends of mine, where I was breathing like this. And he showed me, he's like, don't do that, breathe with this. And instantly, I think it cured a hangover, actually, straight away. This was like a year ago.
Breathing on the top of your chest?
So I was breathing like this normally. And he was like, cause I came up to him and whatever, and I was like, oh, I'm hungover. And he's like, it's because you're breathing badly. And he showed me how to breathe through the stomach. And I did that, and the hangover went away. And it's like, even things like that, which people consider to be normal things, it's like, well, they're not normal things, and they could be doing you damage, and it adds up. And it's, you know, if you get into a sleep deprived state as well, I've had friends like this too, where they've been sleep deprived like their entire lives and they don't realize it. They're like, I sleep 4 hours a night, I don't need to. And they've got these big bags under their eyes. They're not performing whatsoever, but they're up all night. And it's like, well, how long can you last like that?
Yeah,
probably not a long, happy, healthy life.
Yeah, it's this idea of being indestructible and infallible and so on, isn't it? That you can, and psychologically speaking, we're back into the red shoes. They think they can just keep on pushing and pushing and pushing indefinitely and get away with it. But, you know, you have to look after the chassis as well. You have to look after your body. And in order to do that, I think you have to have some understanding. It doesn't have to be, you know, a very sort of deep or technical understanding of things, but I do think there's some basic things that are useful to know about. I'm not sure we're likely to discuss them here today, but maybe in future podcasts we could go into it in a little bit more detail.
Indeed, probably as well, with the topic of the COVID virus, as it's biopsychosocial, maybe switch off the news would be a good thing for optimal health once in a while. Because if everything in every single media channel, everywhere on social media is constantly, and it's all going to be twisted, for not saying it's incorrect, but it will be twisted towards clicks as well.
There'll be a particular spin on it, won't there? Or it'll be skewed in a particular direction. So I think it's probably important that the way in which you select the things you watch, you know, you make good choices about things, and then, like you say, maybe just, you know, switch the rest of it off and go on and do other things.
Yeah, it's like a state-dependent complex in a way, but it's not, you know, a physiological state. It's almost like a social state where the anxiety can come back through again. You know?
Yeah, you can feed it, and just like you can feed any complex neurosis if you look in the wrong place. And we all commonly do this, don't we, when we Google things, and suddenly this plethora of information comes up, and you're then faced with that process of sifting it and sorting it and trying to make some kind of proper meaning out of it and relating it back to yourself. And the process of doing that and how you do that is very important, because you can harm yourself with it, as I'm sure we've probably all experienced doing that. Or you can have, you know, you can take a particular position on it and simply see it as information that isn't necessarily 100% accurate. That the responsibility is on you to be selective and to approach it in a rational way, and to look at other sources and compare it with other pieces of information. So what you do with that information is has to be important for you and for your health and for the health of people around you.
Yeah, and people can be grieved by their complexes as well. I mean, this is something that our research showed, and it's well worth looking into. Because it's one of those transduction pathways between what people, you know, call the mind and call the body, as if they were separate. But it's one of those whole state transducers. It ranks alongside easily the pathways psychoneuroendocrine, psychoneuroimmune. It's definitely on a par with those, and in fact it can regulate both of those paths, and it can disrupt both of those paths. So in some senses it's even more fundamental And it's something that you can, if you get a handle, so to speak, on your breathing, you can control those that way. But you do have to be careful, because there are so many bogus ways of retraining breathing out there.
Yes.
And you do have to be really, really careful about it.
You do.
If you can get access to a respiratory psychophysiologist, it's not easy to, but if you can always get yourself checked out on the capnograph, and then you can see, for yourself indisputably what the figures are, and you can be tested against thoughts, feelings, ideas, emotions, stresses, and then you can begin to introduce the idea of biofeedback. But it's very difficult to alter the partial pressure, that is the pressure inside your arteries, of carbon dioxide through an act of will. It's very, very difficult to do. But oddly, the psyche, the unconscious, can and does regulate these levels. Very, very interesting phenomenon to observe and to investigate, and then to link them to complexes and the solution for complexes too.
You have to make an intervention where you can, don't
Yes,
you?
you do.
So, if you're, for example, unwell in some other way, physiologically unwell because you're exhausted, or I don't know, you might have hay fever rather than COVID-19, or whatever, you to actually get some kind of control back into your life, you have to work on what you can work on. And, I think you're suggesting that, Steve, aren't you, by working on complexes? At least then you might well be in a position to eliminate something which is adding to the overall picture. And that has to be helpful, because otherwise it is a bit of a cascade effect. You get a layering of things, don't you? One on top of the other. So, yeah.
That's a really good point, because again, people, I think these days, are too quick to, when they hear what a complex is, or what they imagine a complex is, to equate that with a cognitive, schema, for example. They're not the same thing, but they are, in the sense that the same observations of people have led different schools of thought to identify the phenomenon as being one thing or the other. But if you reduce things to cognition and the negative automatic thoughts that the cognitive therapists go on about, you miss automatically, you miss the physiological connection. Jung defined complexes as psychophysiological. He said complexes have a physiology of their own, and that they behave like partial personalities, not, by the way, like separate personalities or sub-personalities. This sub-personality therapy was a contagion, pardon the pun, wasn't intended, that ran through the psychotherapy profession in the 1980s, 1990s, and the early 2000s. It persisted in a popular way for a long time. That was just a multiplication of a fantasy, again, into dissociated consciousness, just not real. They're partial personalities, not complete ones. But part of that personality is their physiology. And Jung was able to identify this as far as the physiology of his time and the technology of his time would allow. Now, though, we have better understanding of the connections physiologically, psychophysiologically, and we have better technology to go in after these things and read what their true profile is. You never get psychology without biology. The mind and the body are opposite sides of the same coin. If you approach the head, and for demonstration purpose or illustration purpose, we can call that psychology, the psyche, you only see that because you can't see the reverse side of the coin. If you approach it from the perspective of biomedicine, you only see the tail and you don't see psychology. Psychophysiology approaches the coin from the rim being the transduction zone, where what we call mind and what we call body communicate with one another. It's the crossover area. A psychophysiological approach can tilt the coin to see the tail or the head and understand the rim at the same time. It's a far more powerful model for addressing what are literally systems of representation at so many different levels. And this representation is simultaneous because we are continuous of our environment. Our psychology is continuous of our biology. Our biology is continuous of our psychology as well. So a complex is going to exist in all of these dimensions simultaneously.
I'm bound to think about how something like COVID would be affecting women particularly. And just flowing on from what I was saying about how we harm ourselves by the kind of things that we look at and read, and there's a lot of misinformation as well as good information out there, that a lot of women will be having difficulty with this because of the power of the word, whether it's coming from the internet, the written word in that form, or whether it's from government diktats, or it's coming from the police enforcing things in the way that Steve was describing earlier. They're all things that will be connected to the animus in a woman, and it will decide whether or not that woman relates well to those things or not, and therefore how she relates to herself and her own mental well-being and so on. So I guess I tend to be thinking of it from that perspective, which I would do, wouldn't I?
Well, that affects relationships,
but it affects relationships,
and families,
of course it does,
and kin groups.
It does.
Women are the soul of culture. That's what they are. So anything that damages their psyche damages everything.
Yes.
Because the primitive instinct of man is to go out and act on the world as a hunter. That's the fundamental one. But what you go back to, if the women who are building the soul of culture and all the relationship patterns within that sustains it, if their psyche is damaged, what's it to come back for?
Yes.
What's it to go out and fight for?
Yeah.
So you think women are going to be more likely to be affected by, say, the more panic side of things? Because that's been my observation on social media and in personal relationships too, where the men seem to sort of just get on with it, and the women do seem to be more panicky is the word, not quite panicking, but more on edge. And you reckon this could be, you say, the word primarily through the news, the media,
I
the way
think
things are presented?
I do, James. Yeah, absolutely. Because as we've said before, with respect to the animus, inner and outer, essentially the same thing. How you relate on the inside is how you relate to things on the outside. So if you're a woman and you're already in that kind of situation where you tend to do a lot of damaging self-talk because of the negative animus, then anything that's negative coming back at you through the culture will be received in that way. And depending on how conscious you are of that, how developed you are yourself as a woman, will depend on to what extent it affects you. And therefore anybody else that you happen to be in relationship to. So I think it's entirely possible that that's happening.
Obviously you've been around the political scene longer than myself, but since my interest in politics, I don't know, since I was able to vote, we've been bombarded with so much shite. We have had the Trump thing, we have had the Brexit thing, regardless of what side you fall on. Is this going to be the last straw for people to be like, you're lying to us?
Well, we've been moving towards a nanny state for a long time, haven't we?
Yeah, my instinct despises that.
Well,
it's just an inbuilt thing. It's like, stop taking my money away. Stop telling me what to do.
But people are almost, at the moment particularly, almost prepared to give that up and the freedoms up in order to be looked after. Such is the fear that they have, or the fear that's been instilled in them, that they would happily just give themselves over to the care of the government and the NHS and any other institution for that matter. They'd almost trade those freedoms just to be cared for, like a child will be cared for.
Yeah. And in particular, aren't men going to kick back against this?
Well,
and even women as well, but men do have that drive to provide for the woman, for example, not the other way around. So it's like a double whammy.
Our men have been neutered, James, haven't they?
They have, and I would presume that I would also have been put into the neutered camp as well, if for whatever happened to me didn't happen. But the men, even when I just describe even gun control with friends, it's a neurotic reaction to guns.
It's terrible. Yes, absolutely. It's a terrible thing. I mean, I said to Steve recently about, it was one of my own comments when we were doing the podcast on creativity, where I talked about being a handy person because I didn't feel I could say handy man, which is absolutely ridiculous, because I would have rather just said handyman. I don't feel demeaned in any way as a woman by using those words.
Yeah.
Just
good.
Words.
Good. You're not that sensitive. It's an insult to you to suggest that, oh, my precious head.
Well, men are wonderful, and they should be celebrated for being different. And women should be glad about being different to men. And they should use their own feminine power and not try to be like pseudo men. why would you want that? You'd have to be insane to want to be like that. But it's not politically correct, is it, to say these things? So we all kind of stumble around looking for the right words so as not to offend.
Yeah, in private, conversations will always go, or a lot of the time, that far, up to exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
Then it goes no further. It goes
Yes.
to people complaining about political correctness.
Yes.
And it's like, no one actually, even in personal relationships, will stand up for something. It's always bitterness and complaining.
Yes.
Almost like a gaggle of bitchy women, actually, even
Yes.
among men. It's like, well, it's not fair, I can't say what I want to say. It's like, yes, you can. Yes, you
Yeah.
can. And when I found myself, me being the only one in like an entire university doing it, Jane's really concerned, actually, for my own health. My own stuff, because I was like, I'm going to go outside today because I want to, because of the coronavirus. I'm going to go into town because I want to. She's like, no, don't, you'll get arrested. I'm like, I don't care. And it's actually reached the point where I don't care, because it's like, leave me alone.
Well, it will induce that, won't it? Because like Steve said, it's a natural instinctive reaction to kick back against something that's bad for your health.
What would happen if men were not neutered, and women as well, I guess? And we all, for example, just said we're all going outside today.
Well, they haven't all been. They haven't always been neutered. You have to look to the past.
So, do you reckon the government could have pulled something like this with stronger generations? Say, World War II, World War One. Could the government have done something like this? One little broadcast and said, everyone stay inside now for 3 weeks.
Oh, difficult one, that, because the governments of the past were quite happy to have 2 world wars that killed millions of people.
True.
They were happy to do that. Governments are pathological, end of, no matter what colour they are.
Yes, no matter what persuasion.
Yeah, because power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes.
And anyone who wants power shouldn't be given it, that kind of thing.
And can I just ask, sorry to disturb you on your honour roll, Steve.
That's all right, before I get one on.
But there's a lot of people who will actually acquire a lot of power in this situation that they would never have had before.
Yeah.
And they will abuse it, and we're starting to see those abuses.
Indeed.
And even, going into local supermarkets, you can see people starting to up their game if they're able to push other people around a little bit. You see that unpleasantness growing, and I think it is concerning.
Yeah, it is.
Sorry, Steve.
Oh, it's okay. It's how instincts are marshalled. In the First and Second World Wars, instincts were marshalled patriotically to achieve a particular end, and there was consent for that from the male population, and there was no resistance to that from the female population. So it just happened. And that's the way things had been for thousands of years, it seems, at least since recorded history. When women decide that something isn't going to happen in a culture, then generally it does stop. There are even Greek plays, or at least one Greek play about that, about preventing war by their actions. So there was a consciousness of the power of women when they act together to neuter men in that way, even then. And it certainly happened now. But I don't think it's healthy. And I think underneath it all, there is a very perverting instinct. It's rather similar to the fact that the Catholic Church's view on contraception doesn't serve Christianity so much as it serves Charles Darwin. And that's the secret shadow of it. Sex is for reproduction. That's what they say. And that actually serves Darwinian evolutionary principles far more than it does Christianity as such. And it's a similar thing here, that when women act collectively to neuter men in a particular population, should we say a breeding population, I believe it's called shit testing. If you push that too far and the men give in, the women will then just look to another breeding population from outside who won't take any shit testing at all.
Yeah.
And then they will prove to them at a very fundamental and instinctive level that they are worth breeding with, and their own population aren't. And sadly, this happens. It's happening now. In the Second World War, you got the phenomenon that when the Germans invaded and occupied most of Europe, the women were only too willing to receive them. A large number of them were, because they'd proven that they were more powerful than their own men, that their own culture had failed, and these Germans had marched in with their fascist Nazi ideology and proven that they could take their resources, so therefore they could take the women. And the women were happy. A lot of them, not all, but a lot, It's still serving Charles Darwin.
Yes.
This is the big laugh, and it's an unfortunate, ironic joke that it's serving that. Even in the UK, which was not occupied by the Germans, it was occupied. It was occupied by the Americans. Yeah. And there was plenty of promiscuity with incoming breeding populations of men, whilst the indigenous population of British men were abroad fighting. That happened. You know, I know it happened. It happened within my own family, and it was well known that this happened. And then afterwards, of course, they all pretended that it didn't happen. It hadn't happened. And it was time to repress things for a while. And then the 60s happened, and so forth. All of the cultural changes that have gone on since then. So there is always reproductive pressure, and women will always determine and select who they're going to breed with. That forces male competition. If they reject the men are not going to know what to do with their instincts. The safest thing to do is to neuter them completely, and then they don't become a problem. Yeah? Certainly not politically, because they don't have it anymore in them to fight or to resist. Then if you have an incoming group of people who won't take that, you get a phenomenon similar, sadly, to when red squirrels were replaced by grey. It's just a case of more favourable adaptation to a specific territory, and therefore of a breeding population, and then you get that. Now, this is not making any kind of political judgment or statement either way. I'm not interested in politics.
No.
They're all bad. But I am interested in how instincts manifest, because instincts are the fundamental layer upon which everything is built. And when you overstress a population, and it's happening now, it was already happening with the cultural changes going on. But when you add COVID to that, well, who can be really sure where that's going to go? You can make an informed. It's not been tested to its conclusion yet. No. It's often said that the best prediction of the future is the past. You know, so there are plenty of examples of what will happen when a culture is overstressed, and that their men lose their identity. You can see that. You can see it, as I say, in animal populations, breeding populations. This thing goes on. Instincts underlie everything. If you look after instincts, everything else will resort and look after itself too. If you pervert instinct, you will then pervert the culture, and anything that emerges from it will be likewise perverted. It's as simple as that. Hence the archetypes, as people seem to believe they are just cultural narratives for the frustration or the positive acting out of instinct. That's all they are. They're just dramas written by instincts, archetypes.
Do you think men have contributed to this too, Steve, or they've bought into it? Because I'm kind of thinking about even something like, I know it's controversial, the Gillette advert that went out. And, you know, you see this kind of row of dads doing the barbecue, and there's a couple of lads fighting, and it's like, you know, please, you know, be nice to each other, boys. Yeah. Which is just so contranatural, really, isn't it? Yes. Young lads do scrap and fight and so on. It's instinctive. It's what they do. But you've got these fathers trying to placate them and get them to just be nice to one another.
That will turn up as mental illness.
Well, it will.
We both know this.
Yeah.
That will definitely turn up as mental illness. And it may not be psychotic mental illness, but it will be maladaptation to instincts, which will mean that their complexes take on a specific form. And then their physiological illnesses and degradation will take on a specific form. You'll see a further reduction in sperm count, simply because the instinctive reason to reproduce is being removed. So the instincts will be switched off, and therefore sperm count will fall because you're not going to do anything with it. But what you will see and have seen is FAP en masse, whilst the male population of the suppressed culture tries instinctively to adjust to those pressures. And then, of course, they go to pornography. Most of them probably wouldn't want to pornographize relationships to women, but what are they going to do with those instincts? Yes. And there are positive ways out of that trap, out of the FAP trap. There really, really are. And they're quite simple, and you can get to them. But it will mean men looking at themselves in a slightly different way, and also having a psychodynamic understanding and a biopsychosocial understanding of themselves, and conjoining those two together. And we're working on this, aren't we, James? We're working on getting something ready to deliver on this, because it is needed.
young men have been distracted into fantasy as a whole, haven't they? Not just, fantasy as pornography, but it's like, look over here, just disappear it into that over here, whilst in the meantime your instincts are being
look
suppressed.
Here, there's a new fantasy. Absorb yourself in that. There are heroes in there.
Yes.
But what are the heroes doing? Generally, a lot of it's based on male assertive instincts. If you take any archetypal narrative and again remove the instinctive imperatives that are underlying it, it's nothing. It's two-dimensional at best, and probably completely flat and devoid of life. But shooting games, that's instinctive.
Of course it is.
You're telling me it's archetypal? Yes, but only because it sits on instincts. The men have lost contact with their instincts.
They're not even really allowed to be competitive anymore, are they?
No.
Not only just between themselves, but just in general terms. I mean, we were saying this morning, we can remember a sports day that our son was involved in. Running, it was just a running race, a sprint, and he actually won the race easily. In fact, he kind of ran over towards us to wave to us
halfway
at the halfway point, and then kind of, well, he's intuitive, so he didn't go in a straight line, did he? No. So he kind of angled off and still managed to win the race, but he wasn't rewarded for it. Everybody else had to have a medal and like a little as well.
Rewarded for losing.
So which doesn't help anyone.
We shouldn't be worried about competition. If we have people who succeed and are good at something, we should encourage it, because they will find ways to express that talent. We shouldn't feel diminished by another person's talent. No. We should be thankful that some people are really good at things that we may not be good at, and we should deploy them productively in the service of our culture and our society, our species, and of the environment and the world, wherever level of resolution you want. It is good. It is good that we have people who are good at something and who excel, and we should definitely encourage that, and then look to develop what we can do that's better and be content with it. We'll have a balanced society that is in equilibrium at that point.
Yeah, some of my more instinctual embrace over the last few years, thinking about it, is probably a case of it being suppressed since like day one of school. I became the archetypal, if you like, teacher's pet day one of primary school.
Stereotypical.
I just like the word archetypal because it's going to annoy you.
Just plain.
Could I just quickly say, most primary school teachers are women as well.
Oh yeah.
And they seem to think they know what's best for young boys. And
I'm pretty sure I had exclusively female teachers thinking about it in primary school.
Yes, you probably did have.
Yeah, because there was one time I was 10, I think, and there was a kid. I hated this kid. He was a complete dick. Absolutely hated him. And there was one time he did just sort of turn on me and it's like someone pushed me into him or something, and he turned around and he pushed me away, and something snapped. And I didn't swear or anything. I don't even use swear words at that point. It was like a Catholic primary school, and I beat the ever living shit out of him on the floor. And I was the nicest boy ever. The nicest boy, and the teacher had to literally pull me off of him, and then going into secondary school, I was slapped back down again, that strict Catholic discipline of do your work or else, and then there's always the threat of the parents as well. Your parents are going to be so disappointed in you. Then it builds and builds and builds and builds and builds until now it's like people are kind of shocked when they look at me, not blowing my own trumpet at all, but it's like, you don't do as you're told, and it's like, men shouldn't do as they're told, ever. It should be a mutual agreement from men that they're going to obey the same rules. You should not do as you are told, because then you do, that's when you do find yourself into these little fantasy things. Because the men, if you look at all the men in the big fantasy things, the movies and the video games, they're not done what they're told. None of them are. It's like you do what you want to do.
That's instinctive. Again, it's instinctive. And then the archetype, whatever that is, follows on from the instinct. It is so obvious. People seem to have, and I think this is why, those believing Christians out there, forgive me, this is not meant as a criticism of your faith, but I do think it's a sociocultural observation on the effect that the collective use of that religion has had on the perception of things. Animals have instincts. If people have them, they're just something in the back of your mind, and they're primitive. Animals don't have souls. Animals aren't conscious. Humans are. That attitude pervaded still in the late 19th century. And it meant that the understanding of human instinct was at that level that animals were different. And so if you express an instinct, you are like an animal. Therefore, they are not even psychological. Jung, at various times in his career, treated instincts as if they weren't even psychological. Now, we know that's complete nonsense now. It is absolute nonsense. And just look at what's happening at the moment. You're telling me there's no psychological reaction to instincts? Or are you saying that they're completely different? Instincts are anticipatory sets of behavior that include images and narratives programmed within them. Then when you have culture, culture feeds into the instinct and produces this resultant psychological image that we internalize locally. That is, if you analyze it properly and with all objectivity, is the truth. Human instincts are very sophisticated systems. Just because they're automatic doesn't mean that they're stupid.
Well, breathing's automatic.
Breathing's
you wouldn't want to
automatic.
stop that, would you?
No, all the problems you get with that. but yeah, there is an instinct to want to breathe.
Yes.
But this is where your level of analysis, description, and explanation can mess things up. Human instincts are very, very complicated, evolved things, systems of anticipation and reaction. And the anticipation is forward thinking, it's forward planning. They have a degree of plasticity to them. So those ideas and associations that form around instincts are going to be adaptable to local conditions. And then we have Jungians calling them, well, that's the archetypal image. Underneath it's the archetype. There's no archetype underneath them. There's a very extensive and complex, dare I use the term, instinct, which includes everything that you need to know. And that instinct then is modified and produces complexes. Controversial, I know, but there is no need for an archetypal hypothesis as such at all.
Do you reckon there's anything productive people can do, say men watching, or even women, to feel themselves more instinctually, like right now? Is there anything somebody can do straight away?
I think meditate on them in the broader sense of trying to understand that we are instinctive creatures and that everything progresses from that, and there's nothing wrong with having instincts. And with respect to this present situation, if we don't acknowledge their existence and the fact that they're always there, they will become our enemy, because they will push. They will really, really push. Not just outward though, they'll push against us because we're not doing the right thing. And that generates complexes immediately. That generates anxiety, that will generate disease. It's a cascading effect. So know that they're there, and know really that fundamental human rights are themselves predicated upon instincts. The right to live, the right to be happy, the right to go about your business without being impeded, the right to have a home. All of these fundamental things, never mind how it's actually codified in the Declaration of Human Rights. We all know instinctively, intuitively, if you like. And I'm not saying intuition and instinct are the same. Intuition in that sense is just an apperception of instinct. Instinct presents itself in consciousness through a transduction and then appears to be a symbol or an intuition or whatever. But those things, meditate on those things that really give existence meaning. Meaning itself is instinctive, because if you have meaning in your life, you're content, you're adapted, and you will have status because other people recognize you as an adapted person. You have status and therefore go up in rank socially, simply because you're living an authentic life, and you're more likely to be healthy as well.
I like this as a frame shift. People who get into masculinity and development and all these other things, they go about their life as, I'm currently not a masculine man and I need to become a masculine man, because it's better. Maybe the frame should be, unless you develop yourself into a masculine man, you are a neurotic and you are not in touch with your instincts, and you're not going to be happy, and they're going to push back against you. So it is no masculinity is bad on one side of things, and there is no masculinity is better than where I currently am. It's a case of like, no, you need that, or else you are going to be neurotic and unhappy, right?
Yeah, it's there's so many ways of being a man, and this is why I think we should allow excellence in whatever field to come forward. Masculine excellence, whatever that is, whether it's an excellent warrior, an excellent scientist, an excellent philosopher, an excellent father, whatever excellence is, we should allow it, because that will draw us towards it and make us all improve, and it will lead to a balanced society. We don't have to have a one-sided masculinity any more than a one-sided femininity. We just need balance for a culture to be in balance.
Just to clarify, masculinity, I mean, on an individual level, is allowing your instincts to come out and be secure and confident in that as your own identity. So I don't mean you have to go be the alpha Chad, start lifting weights and sleeping with loads of different women. I mean, be secure, confident in yourself, and letting your instincts out.
Absolutely, they will guide you for what you need. You'll then find the archetypal fantasy or the stereotypical fantasy that you may want to latch onto as a collective myth in order to give you some kind of meaning. Obviously, the step beyond that is to extract out from that by inner work what your actual personal myth is. But yeah, if you access your instincts, they will tell you what you need to do.